Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time it is you're watching this video. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. If you were watching last week, you will have seen me start on the design process for fitting a Texas-based prototype into the confines of an attic room. So now let's continue where we left off and work on squeezing this prototype into the available space.
Here is the first of the more or less to scale drawings that I drew. This is just the lower deck, which is devoted to the area around Cresson, the Cresson yard, which unfortunately I've had to introduce a curve, but there was just no way to avoid that. I have the Y, and I have the signature Mustang Creek Bridge that I showed you a photograph earlier. And I was very happy with the way this fitted into the room, because it even has that broad curve that was seen in the background of the photograph that I showed you earlier, even though the benchwork here is going to be fairly narrow. But since there are tree lines along both sides of the track, the narrowness of the benchwork at this point can easily be disguised. And if modelled well, it will still look great. Obviously this under-over arrangement here is not prototypical, but the branch line off to the south will just disappear before it crosses under this track to disguise the arrangement. And here is the upper deck, which represents Fort Worth and Saginaw. We come up the Helix. Now this isn't meant to be the final form of Davison Yard, it's just a placeholder right now. You have the bridges over the Trinity River. Now unfortunately, being in the corner, we're going to lose the truss arrangement. It's going to have to be a short span trestle. Saginaw Intermodal Yard. Of course, intermodal yards basically have to be straight. The approaches at the end can be curved, but the middle bit has to be straight, otherwise the crane doesn't work properly. And then around the other end of the room, the Saginaw grain elevator complex. Now at this point there's plenty of room for a good sized representation, but unfortunately we have to compromise by going to a single-ended arrangement, whereas on the prototype all the tracks here are double-ended. But there really just isn't room for that. The only way to have got a double-ended arrangement in here would have been to move it to where I put the intermodal yard. But then the intermodal yard won't work at this end of the room because there's no way of getting a long enough straight. Even if I were to go the other way around the Helix, it still wouldn't work very well because at least half the length of the yard would not be easily accessible. And of course there would be the problem of disguising the tracks in front of it as it comes around to bite its own tail. Now something else that became apparent as I was drawing this plan is that the original idea of having staging on both levels was not going to work. It's clearly necessary to squeeze every little bit of the room that we can just to represent the signature scenes that the customer wanted. And then there's going to have to be a third level for staging just below this one. So now we have 3 full decks, one of which is entirely staging yards and the other 2 are scenic decks. Now although the customer was generally happy about what I was able to fit in his space for him, he did feel that there was one major problem with the design. The Trinity River Bridge in this corner. He really wanted to straighten that out and make a better job of that scene. So I thought about it and figured that if we were to eliminate the Cresson Y, let's go back to the previous drawing, to get the Y track in, and by the way, even in this area I had to reduce the radius. Getting the Y track in requires this entire corner to be utilised for what has now become a turnback curve. And since he's operating all modern diesels, there's no need to turn anything on the Y. And I don't see it being a problem, all the branch line trains coming up, going straight into the yard. They don't necessarily have to take the third route of the Y. So if we eliminate the Y, we can reclaim all this area in here, and we still have the 2 important routes. It's the unimportant one that is eliminated. So this is what the lower deck looks like with the Y eliminated. I've also drawn in Crescent East siding, which now is closer to the aisle and therefore better accessible than it would have been with the Y arrangement. And just by changing the shape of the benchwork, we've gained another straight area, which I'll show you in a minute. And as a side advantage, we now have the opportunity to move this fascia out a few inches and widen this area of very narrow benchwork. But here's the upper deck. At this point I've drawn in more of the yard areas, showing the arrangement of the rectangular locomotive shops between the 2 halves of the yard. although as I mentioned earlier, it should be just the yard approaches at this point. Here we have the entire modelled version of the yard, because clearly there's just no room in here for anything. And we're now able to get a short area of straight across the river, and the river crossing can be the full 4 tracks wide. Now on the prototype, I believe it is the back 2 tracks that are the main lines and the front 2 tracks that are the yard leads. Here we've had to reverse it. We have the main lines in front and the yard leads behind. That is unavoidable, but it's a compromise the customer was happy with. I've also at this point drawn in a short industrial branch line because there was a fair amount of rail served industry in the Fort Worth area, even though it should be the other side of the yard. And I'm thinking there will be a similar sized area available around the Saginaw Grain Elevator Complex for some more industries. Here I've drawn in a few more details and plotted all the yard approaches accurately. I've also shown how most of the smaller rail-served industries around the Saginaw area can be included. And I say rail-served. Looking at the satellite photographs, some of them are obviously still rail-served, and others look as though they could have been at one time. And I've chosen to assume that they still are. I'll just call it modeller's license. The industries in this area, Ventura Foods and what looks like an oil refinery, although they are in approximately this location behind the grain elevator, they are approached from the opposite direction. But since the main line disappears from the visible portion of the layout just past the elevator, that clearly isn't going to be possible. So I've taken the branch line off from here. It'll just be hidden behind trees and structures along this area, reappearing behind the grain elevator. So at this point we were able to confirm that the track arrangements that we wanted will indeed fit in the space that he has available, albeit at the expense of many curved turnouts in this area. And here is the middle deck filled out to the same status as the other one. You can see now I've drawn crescent yard to scale. I've drawn all the industrial spurs in the vicinity of the Y in their approximate relative locations. There are a few tracks missing. This should have been 3 tracks in here instead of 1, and there are a couple more spurs in this area. And of course the Y should branch out here and then rejoin between Henson Lumber and the east siding, which actually on the prototype is 2 sidings. And the satellite photograph shows long strings of covered hoppers parked there. So I'm guessing they use them for storage rather than for passing trains. Now there is also a short double-ended track at this point between Henson Lumber. It should end before the grade crossing, because on the satellite photograph shows that this highway has only 1 track across it. Anyway, I definitely wanted to include this track because the satellite photograph shows a pair of locomotives parked on it. So obviously it is an important track. I don't know whether those locomotives were on a local turn that was laying over there, or whether they were helpers. I don't know if there's any grades in the area. I wasn't paid to do a lot of prototype research, but clearly it was a track that needed to be included. And there wasn't really enough space to end it before the grade crossing. So I extended it across and joined it up after the start of the yard ladder. That has another benefit on a model railroad where train densities are generally higher. Whereas on the prototype, it is necessary to switch the yard using the main line. But with this arrangement, we have the option of having the through trains use the rear track, leaving the front track and the branch line as a switching lead, to avoid having to stop work while a train is due. The yard should have been 7 tracks wide, although reducing it to 5 leaves a little space for scenery along both sides here, where it was narrowest. And the only other place where I've departed from the prototype arrangement is adding this industry here. There's a nice big area which did not have any industries on the prototype, but I knew the customer had other things that he would like to include, so I just called this Industry X for the time being. And he immediately came back and told me that he wanted a cement works there, representing one that did exist on the prototype somewhere in this vicinity, although I was not able to find it on the satellite photographs. So I don't know quite where it has been relocated from. Now the peninsula is all open country, and I've moved the backdrops forward a little bit to narrow the benchwork for most of its length, making these scenes appear longer, while still opening out for a nice wide scene for his signature Mustang Creek scene. Also the gap between the backdrops allows plenty of room for structure to hold up the upper deck. At this point I hadn't fully designed the structure, but I will have to come back and address it because the client has asked for me to do that extra. And then there's a smaller creek on the other side of the peninsula. If you recall, I showed you a photograph of a smaller trestle we also want to include. So here is a good place to put it. And there was indeed another creek just before Primrose Siding, although it looked as though it was a very similar bridge to the one over Mustang Creek. Here we've decided it's a smaller one closer to track level. And then the presence of Primrose Siding at this point is a great opportunity to bring the start of the double track out into plain view. So with the whole of the Helix being double tracked, we're not going to have any bottlenecks. Since with all the upper deck being a double track main, we want to be able to have a reasonable train density up there. And the last thing we're going to want is about 2 scale miles of single track on the Helix. Now the Helixes between the middle and lower decks are quite complicated. I'll start with the one under Fort Worth Yard. The double track Helix ends at the middle deck, but the client wanted continuous running options. So the inner track of the Helix continues down to the staging level, and with this connection and the addition of this crossover here, crossover C I've labelled it, that gives us 2 independent continuous circuits which you can use to let trains run while he's switching other areas, or if he wants to entertain visitors who don't really care for the switching. And also under this Helix, the branch line has dropped down a few inches and will continue around on the outer track of the lower Helix. So although the benchwork will be built as a double track Helix the whole way, there'll be a couple of laps that only have a single track on them, because at point A we're already about 4 inches below the base level for the middle deck, whereas this section over Mustang Creek is going to rise slightly, and here we're going to be at about plus 4 inches. So there'll be 2 laps with only a single track on it. Now the other Helix under the grain elevator is even more complicated. It's 2 completely separate helixes, and in order to get everything to fit, they have to rise in opposite directions. The main double track Helix to the top deck and the single track Helix to the bottom one. That's because at this point the connection to Crescent Yard had to come off the inner loop of this Helix, otherwise it wasn't going to work. Which means that we've lost the option of continuing this double track Helix downwards, so instead it's been unwrapped and becomes a ramp track running all the way around the outside of the room. I will show you the rest of that later with the staging level. There will probably also be a need for some removable chunks of scenery along here for emergency access.
Well, that's all for this week. Next week I will conclude this mini-series by finishing off the design with all the details that it needs. And I'll also be going into depth on how the extensive staging yards will work on this layout. So until then, keep well, and I'll see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.